Today we are learning from Dr. Tessie Bailey. As a national expert on special education, transition, and MTSS and RTI for states and districts through the National Center on Intensive Intervention and the National Center on Systemic Improvement. She is the principal consultant for the National Center on Intensive Intervention and the director on the MTSS Center. And what is really exciting to us is she is the director of the New Progress Center and serves as the Project Quality Assurance Director for the new Wyoming MTSS Center. More information will be coming out in future weeks about that. We have been blessed to have her support Wyoming in our Department of Ed for the last 8 years. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tessie Bailey.
Thanks, Susan. I'm very excited to be here. And as Susan mentioned, I'm very excited about new work that's been happening in the state. And I'm so impressed by what's happening with the WAVE conference to make sure that folks have access to high quality professional development in a way that's accessible under this new context. So I have with me Supriya Mang, who will be helping. She will be providing a lot of resources as well in the chat box as I'm speaking. So if I do highlight something, you should be able to find the link to that actual resource in the chat box. Something else that you will see in the chat box that I really want to point you to is the notes for today, as well as all the activity handouts are available to you. While you don't need to download the notes, the PowerPoint notes, I do recommend that you, at this moment, click on the link to the handout for the materials for today's session. We're going to do some activities, and you can't really see the handout on my screen because it's a tiny screen, but in that handout packet are all of the things that you will need to independently do the activity. Now, typically we would be able to use like a breakout session if we were in a face-to-face setting, but because of the format of our session, we have to kind of do it a little bit differently. So I really encourage you to use the chat box, share your thoughts, your questions, and so we can have a more active discussion the best that we can in this sort of format. So for example, I want to just orient people to the chat box right now, and we're going to do a little practice opportunity. So you'll see that there are a picture of 9 cats on there. Now, some of you may say, I'm not a cat person, I'm a dog person, but next time I'll do a dog one. And so what I'd like you to do is just find your chat box, open it up, and then just put the number of the picture that represents how you're feeling today. The end of January, right? So I see a couple of 4s. Thanks, Steve. Jennifer got some 5s. Heather got a 7. I see that some of my early ones, Wendy was at an 8. I love it. And Kathy at a 5. I actually see a lot of 5s in here with some 4s, a couple of 8s, definitely some 2s. I think sometimes depending on like which minute it is, I might sort of fluctuate between a 9 and a 4. So we'll see what happens. So I encourage you to use the chat box, and then I'll just give you a couple more seconds to find that link in the chat box. If you need it again, we'll post it. But find the handout packet. It will probably be the most useful to you. The first handout in that packet really summarizes the goal setting strategies I'll share today. And then the second page has some of our activity handouts to help make this a little more engaging and a little more applicable to your work. All right, love it. Some 3s. I like that, Jennifer. Lots of 8s. I'm going to hang out with you guys. All right, so our session today, we really have 3 main goals. And the first one is just to really clarify why goal setting is so important. And at the early childhood level, to me, I think it's even more critical because parents really need to understand what it is we're focusing our efforts on in terms of instruction and supports. And it also really helps us demonstrate progress, right? Is this student ready for the next age level classroom, or are they ready for kindergarten? And so we want to make sure that we're clear about our outcomes. So I'm going to talk about 2 ways in which the Division of Early Childhood approaches goal setting, from what we refer to as a mastery measure, as well as a general outcome measure. I'm also going to talk about 3 validated goal setting approaches, as well as some tools that you might use to monitor, right? It doesn't really matter if we set a goal if it's just for the IEP. We want to be able to set the goal so that we have a clear idea about where we're headed, but then we also want to make sure that the progress monitoring, which is required under IDEA, is feasible, right? So let's pick something that can be valid and reliable, but is generally feasible for us to do. Now, I suspect many of you don't have a lot of time with your kids, right? You might meet with them 2 times a week for 45 minutes. Maybe you get a little bit more time. So we have to think about this feasibility so that the majority of time we spend with students is on instruction, and that the goal is helping us be focused in that 45 minutes. Now, progress monitoring is really the whole point of setting a goal, right? It's not just for compliance purposes or to meet the Supreme Court decision from Andrew in 2017. Progress monitoring towards a validated goal helps us as a system as well. It helps us determine rates of improvement. So we can make claims about what does this student need in order to make an appropriate amount of growth. It also gives us more confidence in being able to say, this approach that I'm doing with these kids works at this level, and this approach is not getting as much effect. So then I can make valid decisions about getting rid of a program, refining a program, or potentially purchasing a new program. The other thing that it helps us with, which is probably most important in the real time, is helping us identify if the student is actually responding to the IEP or the SDI that I have provided, right? Or specially designed instruction. So have I designed a program, even if it's only 2 times 45 minutes a week, that's helping the kid move towards goals? If we don't have validated goals, what happens is the kid might look like they're making progress, but the progress may not really mean anything, right? So it's not adequate progress. And then finally, having these validated goals allows us to monitor the student and determine when instructional changes are needed. And I'm not talking about redoing the IEP, because the goal is the goal. The class that you designed are really to help you set that valid goal. You have designed your specially designed instruction, your supplemental aids and services, and your accommodations to really help the student move towards that. Sometimes things change, and understanding where the kid is going and how they're performing in relation to that allows us to make timely changes to prevent the kid from not meeting that goal. Now, before we get started, I just want to share this sort of misconception that happens a lot in the field. Is there's sometimes, even though the words in the phrase are similar, the sequencing of the words matter, right? Monitoring progress is not the same as progress monitoring, and that matters, right? So what I'd like you to do is just take a quick second or two, and I'm going to go through and highlight a couple of them. But reflect on what you currently do to monitor whether kids are progressing. Are you really just doing general practices for monitoring progress, or are you really progress monitoring? Because what you'll find is goal setting really only applies to the right one, progress monitoring. If we think about everything we do in terms of understanding progress as monitoring progress, we often don't see the value of setting a very standardized goal for the student. So if you think about monitoring progress, this in a nutshell is what we should do as good teachers. It's where we're sitting in our class, we have our 45-minute group, and our kids are there, and we are constantly taking these little checks to say, oh, he's getting it, ooh, he's not getting it. And that real-time monitoring of progress allows us to then respond in real time to adapt our instruction, to intensify, to provide more practice opportunities. And because it's in real time, it's less standardized, right? It's more informal. It may be things like observations. I look at, did the kid actually match the two things, or did he point to something? And it just is what we do on a day-to-day basis. And I will say that we do it for all kids, whether they have disabilities or they're in special education. All kids get access to teachers who are monitoring progress. Now, progress monitoring is where we tend to see the greatest effects, though. We will always see effects for monitoring progress. But for us to see consistent growth for students, we need this very intentional, focused progress monitoring. So in order for us to do that, it needs to be standardized, meaning we have the same way in which we're collecting the data using a valid and reliable tool. And so it could be as simple as you recreated it, right? Is every Friday, the kid is working on 5 colors. I do a standardized assessment of what color, what color, what color, and then I take data on that. And then what I look at is change over time. It's usually not directly connected to what I'm teaching, right? If I'm just teaching red, I'm not going to just teach red. But if I'm teaching colors, that's the ultimate outcome, then I'm going to assess on what that is. And we're going to learn that that's called a general outcome measure. Now, the thing about progress monitoring is it requires a validated goal. We have to have somewhere that we're going. And that's what we're going to focus on today. And once you have that validated goal, then you can use data collection tools that allow you to graph data against the goal and make more confident decisions about whether the student is responding or not responding. Now, in a typical school, and it kind of depends on the EC program that you have set up, some of you only have kids with disabilities, some of you may have a mixture. In a more standardized setting, we tend to see that no more than 20 to 25% of students would be progress monitored, right? It's not something we do for every kid. If you were in a special education only setup, you might find that all of your kids are being progress monitored. So in those cases, we look for more feasible, low cost, efficient ways in which to collect progress monitoring data. Now, what I'd like to do is just to get a sense about what you're using for progress monitoring, right? So think about the distinctions that we just said with monitoring progress and progress monitoring. And so Supriya will put in the chat box, you'll see a link to a Menti board. And this is where you'll be able to input your just the names of what you're doing. And it's okay if they're teacher created, just give us a brief description of what that looks like, or if you have a name of something that you're using, and then I'll share that with everyone. All right, I'm starting to see things like checklists, dibbles, keep them coming, fast bridge, letter sound. Portfolios. And a lot of times people don't think portfolios are progress monitoring tools, but if you're using standardized approaches for the development and the analysis of them, they could serve in that role. Sight word lists, same thing. The list itself may not be standardized, but it's the way you use it. So thanks for sharing that. When I say using it, what you could say is, how many sight words can the kid do, let's say, in 1 minute, and then set a goal. And we know that for kids, it's typically about 35 sight words per minute is considered proficiency at the grade level in which you're working on. And for those of you who aren't familiar, things like Dibbles and FastBridge, these are standardized tools that are available by publishers. and they already have the psychometric properties. And that's kind of a nerdy word for like the validity and the reliability that tells us the tool itself is going to give us accurate data. Yeah, Cubed, and I think that's the one that's out of Wyoming, Moby Max, Ames, and Review 360. And what's interesting is you'll see there are two types of measures here that we're going to talk about. One is the mastery measure, which is more of like a single skill, kind of like your sight words. But then there's also general outcome measures. And a good sort of precursor to that is if you think about sight words are often not our ultimate outcome, right? Really what we want kids to be able to do is eventually read connected text. But sight words are an essential piece to be able to do that skill, right? So we think about that often as a mastery measure or like a single skill measure that's a prerequisite for this general outcome. All right, well, keep sharing those as you see them. I'll keep it open. And as you're looking at some of the videos and things that we talk about, some other things might sort of get you thinking about what's available. So as we get, moving forward, I want you to start to think how they're being used. And sometimes we have these great tools, but we maybe don't use them the way they're supposed to be used. We use them as a pre-post. And really, when we think about the use of these tools, they're on a frequent basis on a regular schedule, right? Whether it's every week or every other week, because we need that consistency in data collection graphed against a valid goal that allows us to make claims about progress. So I just want to share real quickly, just to give you some context when we start to talk about the goal setting tools that we may use, is there really are two critical pieces that are necessary for us to meet IDEA's requirement or our Tier 2, Tier 3 progress monitoring requirements around this concept of progress monitoring. First, as I mentioned, we need a valid and reliable tool, and then we need to have processes in place. Now, when we think about goal setting, we have to set the goal on a tool in which we will still be progress monitoring it, right? So if I'm using a tool that is like a diagnostic assessment, that's not going to work, right? Because while it might give me a baseline and maybe I can set an idea of where I want it to be in 9 months, I can't use that diagnostic tool in between those to really understand growth because they're not validated for that. So what we look for are tools that have alternate forms. And these are forms that I can give a probe, it's kind of another name for it, every week or every other week, or maybe even monthly. So the research indicates for us to say we have a tool that we can progress monitor for, we need 9 alternate forms, or 9 forms that are of equal difficulty, right? They don't get harder, they get of equal difficulty. If you're doing progress monitoring with a kid who has more intensive needs, particularly kids in special education, then this is where we're looking for about 20 alternate forms, because I want to do more frequent progress monitoring, which is likely to be every week. Some other things that are going to be essential for validated goal setting is we have to have a tool that has data around what is expected growth and what are benchmarks, because those two pieces of information tell us what would be realistic for a kid at this age or this grade level in order to benefit, right? And so once we've got a tool that has this growth and benchmarks, what we're also looking for is this a reliable and valid measure? Because I can have a great tool, but if it doesn't really I don't have confidence that it's valid and reliable, then what often happens is teachers overassess. They think, well, I don't really know if that's right or not, so I'm going to do another diagnostic. And I'm not really sure if that's right, so I'm going to do another one. And then we end up over-testing the kid, which then takes away from instruction. So we want to start out with something that's brief, but reliable and valid. The other thing, the critical feature of progress monitoring is around the procedures. And this is where goal setting fits in. And we have to be able to set a goal that can be monitored at least weekly or monthly, right? Anything less frequent than that, let's say every quarter, is likely to fall more under a benchmark test as opposed to a progress monitoring, and doesn't really give us a good sense about overall progress, nor does it allow us to get information in a timely manner so that we can adapt the intervention or the SDI before we get to that benchmark, right? So some procedures in place. I'm only going to talk about goal setting today, but I want you to think about goal setting in this bigger system of progress monitoring, is that we have to make sure we're identifying the right kids who need progress monitoring goals. And then once we set that goal using a validated approach, are we actually collecting data and monitoring against the goal? Because if you're just going to do the goal for your IEP and not use it for instructional purposes, it's not really going to benefit you, right? It's a lot of time spent for a compliance purpose, but not really to achieve results. So the Division of Early Childhood has recommendations for how we do a curriculum assessment and program evaluations. And it hasn't been updated primarily because the research hasn't really changed. And I want to talk about these two assessments because they have implications for how we set goals. In early childhood, we tend to see a greater focus on critical skill mastery, right? Where we say, I want kids to know a specific number of colors or a specific group of letters or a specific math skill or specific behavior. And so we think about that as the mastery of individual skills. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but sometimes what happens is it gets disconnected from the overall instruction that the kid is being provided. And so while you and your special education program might be focusing on these skills, the kid then goes over to a general education setting in which they're not reinforcing those skills. So there's kind of a disconnect when we get too focused on mastery measures that don't align to the broader curriculum. And that's where this idea of general outcome measures have really come from, is that we're looking at measures of overall proficiency or academic performance or behavioral expectations that we would expect the kid to achieve. Now, for early childhood, and I think about preschool, 3- and 4-year-olds, and kindergarten and first grade, there are a lot of measures that exist that sometimes feel disconnected from the curriculum, but are really assessing the underlying skills that are predictors or indicators of success in the curriculum, right? And what it means is, for example, in a skill mastery measure, I will directly teach that skill. And that's what it looks like here. So in a mastery measure, and this is just an example, is I have a letter, I have a word, I have a picture that I'm directly teaching the name of or the skill to do. And then once the kid does it, my progress monitoring data says the kid mastered it. And then I move on to the next one. So here is an example. I'm teaching letter A, it's part of the curriculum, and I monitor the extent to which the kid is making progress. And what I see is that this student made progress towards that mastery, which my IEP goal in this case likely said the student will demonstrate, will be able to name or point to, or whatever it might be, a certain number of letters with 3 consecutive probes, right? So that's where they got the 3 probes. Demonstrated mastery of A, then they move on to the next one. This is where we think about mastery measures that directly align with the scope and sequence. I move to the next letter or the next sound or the next, whatever is the next, and then I monitor progress or proficiency on that particular subskill. Now, if you look at this, you probably notice that the kid was able to master A fairly quickly, but when introducing a new item, right, what we see is a slower trajectory to mastery. There are a lot of benefits to this type of progress monitoring. Now, it actually has more benefits in terms of instruction. And so what I'd like to do is just to get you to think about, and I'll put it back on that slide, What do you see as advantages of having these type of data? With a progress monitoring goal, you'll see would have been, I need this kid to do 8 out of 10. That's the goal that would have been set for the student. What would be a benefit that you would see from this? So just type it in the chat. Or are you using this type of measure? That would be helpful to you. Oh, you guys are my quiet group. All right, well, I gave you sufficient wait time. Yeah, so makes targeting interventions easier. And Lindsay, that's exactly right. There's a lot of advantages for instructional decision making, for targeting the way we design the intervention. And I think more importantly, it tells us if a kid can learn the skill. And sometimes what we're trying to really distinguish is, can the kid learn the skill and what's necessary to learn it, as well as can this kid use the skill, right? That's a whole nother type of thing. But this one tells us, can they learn it? Because if they can learn it, then I can adapt the instruction to help them transfer that learning to a community setting, to a general education classroom, to the playground. Now, there are some limitations. And so can you think of anything that might be a limitation for that particular progress monitoring approach or goal setting approach? And if you don't know, you can kind of cheat off the PowerPoint presentation that's on the links that were provided. So yeah, so what we see is that while it tells us if a kid can learn a skill, it doesn't really tell us, can the kid use the skill? And that's really the most critical part of education, right? It's not just the knowledge of it, but the knowledge of what it is and how to use it is what allows a kid to be successful. The other thing that we find is the scope and sequence that we use for pre-literacy, early numeracy, or even behavior is completely arbitrary. We just made up that sequence. There's no empirical evidence that says it needs to be done in that way. And so sometimes we get stuck in that, oh my gosh, they haven't mastered S, we can't move on to something else, and that can actually put the kid at a. So what we look at are things like general outcome measures, and general outcome measures help us really look at the overall curriculum, right? And these are preferred for IEP goals because they look at the curriculum or learning over a year. When we set mastery measures, like a certain number of letters or a certain number of words or pictures or sounds, we don't really know what is the time frame to do that. And technically, if I did really intensive intervention, I could probably teach a kid to do something in a very short period of time. And while they may have mastered that individual skill, it doesn't mean it's helping them do whatever they needed to do, which is increase, let's say, social interactions or following directions, or even, engaging with literacy materials or early numeracy materials. So general outcome measures allow us to be able to do that. And I'm going to share and I'm going to talk primarily about those today, which is why I wanted to give you a kind of setup about the direction. So here's an example. It's a pre-literacy skill. If you're in kindergarten and first grade, it would be an early literacy skill. But we have a baseline for the student. We set a goal based on where kids would need to be proficient, right? If I'm a 4-year-old who's going to be moving into kindergarten, I want to be able to have those prerequisite skills necessary for success in kindergarten. If I'm in kindergarten and I'm looking to transfer to first grade, I want to make sure that I have the essential skills to be able to access and benefit from core curriculum. So there are benchmarks, and we'll talk about where to find those, that allow me to say, in order for this kid to be ready, I need the kid to be here. And then we can look back and say, based on where they are in their present levels of academic and functional performance, their baseline, I need to get them to here. What's the level of service and supports necessary to get from baseline to that goal? In some cases, it's not realistic. The kid is like 5 years behind, or there's really significant gaps. But we use that understanding of where the kid needs to be and where they are to make the decisions. But most cases, particularly in early childhood, what we see is our greatest window of opportunity. And so we don't want to shortchange the student by setting an expectation that's considered unambitious. And that's where the Andrew Supreme Court decision really made clear that you have to design an IEP that's reasonably calculated to allow the student to progress in their general education curriculum. So we're looking for ambitious but appropriate goal setting. So some advantages, and please feel free to write those in the chat box if you can see some of them, is the nice thing about a general outcome measure is it takes the end skill, right? What I expect the kid to be able to do at the end of the year and assesses them on that end skill on a regular basis, right? So the test doesn't get harder, or the items or distractors don't get harder, but it allows the kid to demonstrate, are they learning outside of my context? So for example, you may be working with the kid in special education for 45 minutes, but then they're in a general education for another 4 hours during that day. And they may be getting practice opportunities, instruction that's benefiting them. And you won't know that if you're only assessing what you're teaching in your special education program. So instead, a general outcome measure says, is there any benefit from what you're doing in my program, plus this general education program, plus what's happening at home that's allowing you to progress? So I assess the skill as a broader skill. So some other advantages, for one, it's curriculum independent. It is not directly aligned with any program. And in fact, you don't even have to purchase a program. There's no assumptions about instructional hierarchy, and that allows you to more individually design your program for your kids. Not all kids need to learn S second. It could be that we're going to teach the kid the letters in their names first because they have more relevance to the student. But what you're looking at is this overall general outcome of, can they recognize or write their name? So what it allows us to do is also understand if a kid can learn a skill, but also can they apply that skill in a novel situation, which is really a struggle for kids with disabilities or kids who struggle in school. It's that inability to generalize the learned skills that is preventing them from being successful. So there are some common pre-literacy and early literacy measures that we see, and I just pulled out pre-K and kindergarten, but I'm going to send you a link that also lets you understand that it goes all the way. These measures that happen in pre-literacy and 3 and 4-year-old programs aligns directly with a student's success in reading at 8th grade and high school. Right? So it's not these disconnected measures, but it's these indicators at different age and grade levels that we use to look at performance. And the goals are meant to say, if a kid wants to be ready for the next grade, this is where they need to be, or ready for the next age level program, this is where they need to be. So you'll see some examples here. So when we think about pre-K, sort of pre-literacy skills, kids who have access to these pre-literacy skills are much better prepared for kindergarten, right? So that's why we see this focus. And sometimes we don't really think about these as intentionally because we're more concerned about the students' behavioral supports or emotional or social supports. But it's also these pre-academic skills that helps them sort of be generally prepared for kindergarten, 1st grade, or 2nd grade. Now you'll look at them that they're not things like writing, right? They're pretty, can you name pictures? Can you hear sounds? You know your letters, or at least a portion of letters. If you were having a story, do you have oral comprehension and then sort of general phonological awareness? Those directly align with indicators that we see for success in kindergarten, right? And kindergarten has the same for 1st grade, where we look at letter naming fluency. And it's not that they know all their letters. It's really, can they rapidly recall the name of at least 11 letters? It's not a big goal, but at least 11 letters at the beginning of kindergarten. So understanding what the expectation is for the grade they're going to or the age they're going to can help us also think about valid goal setting for our goals. Now, I wanted to share just briefly about math as well, because with math, there are the same pre sort of academic skills that we would expect. Numeracy begins very early on. And in fact, early numeracy is often considered to be learned outside of the school context. And that it's when we get into the school context that we're using that understanding of early numeracy that allows us to build upon it and do much more advanced calculation. Now, for kids who struggle in math, if we don't provide some of those explicit opportunities in this early numeracy, they may not get it, particularly kids with low SES, who have lack of opportunity, or who have learning disabilities. So when we think about those goal setting, even though the kid is a 3 and a 4-year-old, you really need to be thinking about, are we providing not just the behavioral skills the kid needs, but the pre-academic skills necessary for them to access and benefit, as Susan said in the chat box. So they're pretty simple, right? And they may be things that you do on a regular basis: oral counting, recognizing numbers. But this quantity comparison and one-to-one correspondence are really things that we often do in peer play. And these align with what we also see at the need for kindergarten, early numeracy. And so the counting, we expect kids to be able to count 1 to 10. So a realistic goal for counting for a 4-year-old would be to count 1 to 10, right? If we're saying, well, this 4-year-old needs to be able to count to 20, we're in a sense setting a higher expectation than what we would typically see. We can do that, but in terms of specially designed instruction, what we're trying to do is make the kid ready for the next opportunity. The other thing that we see in math is this quantity, is getting kids to count. That can they count on the dice? You can do this with all sorts of things in your chat box. Okay. And I think there's some links, Supriya, that we can put for folks to access some of these measures. Is that correct? But if not, these are available. A couple of you mentioned DIBELS. You'll see that they're designed very similarly to DIBELS because it's the standardized process that's been validated. And you can use that same process to assess various different skill sets: early numeracy, early literacy, same with sort of scribbling or language that we would see in the early grades. Now, I'm also going to talk about today in terms of behavior. And I want to make clear that there's no preference for one or the other. And generally, we look at, the functional performance and the academic performance of kids when we write a present level of, or a PLAF, a present level of academic and functional performance. We are obligated to address all of those. And in early childhood, even if we have a 4-year-old or a 3 or 4-year-old, we're still looking at some of those pre-academic skills that are going to help make sure the kid is ready as they move forward. We're not teaching the kid to read, right? We're not teaching them to write. That's not developmentally appropriate, but we're providing them the opportunities and the prerequisite skills to benefit. So with behavior, which is where we tend to see a lot more of the IEP goals or goals in early childhood, is thinking about this same idea of mastery measure versus general outcome measure. And with mastery measure, we are often looking at a single skill. How many times does the kid get out of their seat? How many times do they raise their hand, right? That's a very specific skill. That's not always beneficial for kids moving into a more general education setting or moving into an upper grade level. So I'm going to talk about the direct behavior rating, which looks at more generally the skills you're thinking about, which is academic readiness, right? That they have the skill sets necessary to be a learner. It's not just one skill, but it's a compilation of skills. So it's more general outcome. It's the same thing with respect or disruptive behavior. So instead of focusing our IEP goals on a single behavior, which could change over time, right? Now he's into hitting, next time he's into pulling hair, the next time he's into breaking stuff, right? We don't want to have to change the IEP goal. So instead, we think of a more general behavioral goal that's something like disruptive behavior. And we can create something like that to progress monitor. Thanks for putting those in there, Supriya. So I just want to show you a quick video of what it looks like for these types of measures. And you know, the focus of these measures for goal setting is really around proficiency, not just mastery. And so I really encourage you to, you know, in a next step is look at your goals and say, gosh, are my goals just focusing on the kid knowing that skill? Or is the goal really on the kid using that skill? All right, so we're going to just watch a quick video. It's super short, but this is an example of kind of what we were just talking about.
In this segment, I'm
going to get it set up just real quickly. So what you'll see is at the beginning, they're going to talk about the standardization of it, which is really critical because if I set a goal for a specific skill, I want to be able to systematically assess toward that specific skill. So this is picture naming. It's an early childhood measure that can be used for 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, but it's what we consider as an early literacy or a pre-literacy skill set. It's not about reading, but it's the underlying skills necessary to eventually become a reader.
We'll watch Alicia administer picture naming, a measure of oral language development. As you watch this assessment, notice Alicia politely but firmly teaches the child to follow her directions, to wait when it's the examiner's turn, and to respond when it's the child's turn. Also, listen carefully to the child's responses. And remember that only the words on the cards are correct responses. Even if it seems logical or close, if the child doesn't provide the specific word, the response is counted as incorrect.
Now, as we talked about earlier, remember that standardization is really critical. And it's not that we're looking for the kid to get proficiency on the first go round. What we're trying to do is get an understanding of what is their level of proficiency so we can set a realistic goal and then be able to monitor progress towards that goal. The other thing is you'll hear about the standard administration. One of the things they don't mention is that we don't teach to this test, right? Meaning we're not going to take an apple and teach the kid the word apple and then test them on the fact that did they know the word apple, right? We're not looking at a direct measure of what we taught. We're looking at an application of what we taught. So if you have questions, put that in the chat box, but I just wanted to set that up.
Apple. Oh, hold on. I'm going to look at these cards and name these pictures. Apple. Baby. Now it's your turn.
Bear.
That's right. It's a bear.
Cat.
It's your turn again. That's right. It's a cat. Now we're going to look at some more pictures. I want you to name them.
Pear. Wolf. Egg. Cantaloupe. Meatloaf. Gate. Lock.
My cards are sticking here. There we go.
Eagle. Swimming pool.
Good working.
Snake. Cherry. Sandwich. Cone. Person.
One more.
Bat.
I think we are all done. High five. Great working. Good.
So what are some of the things that you noticed? And you can just write them in the chat box. Hopefully we'll get at least 1 or 2 responses. Yeah, she was modeling, so she started it out. We're not expecting the kid to do a skill that they've never seen before. So there's always a practice opportunity so they understand what's being asked. Yes, Lindsay, she did not correct mistakes. And this is something in progress monitoring. If we set a goal, typically what we're expecting is proficiency with independence, right? And so if we want to be able to progress monitor whether the kid is showing independence in that skill, we don't give any feedback, right? So it's, even if we're like, oh my gosh, we've been working on that, I can't believe she said meatloaf for brain, what we're not doing is using this as a teaching opportunity. And that allows us to really measure progress towards a valid goal, right? Now, if you look at this, you think, well, how many was she supposed to get right, right? Like, what is realistic? And that's what published tools like this provide, is they say generally a typically developing 4-year-old in the beginning of the year would be able to name X number of pictures. And at the end of the year would be able to name X number of pictures. And having that standardization helps us be more confident in our goal setting. So I can say, gosh, for you to be able to do rapid recall with picture naming, which is an indicator of future reading success, I need you to be able to rapidly name about, and I don't know how many there were, like 8 out of 10 would be the national benchmark or something. Now, these exist for all types of stuff: language, reading, or pre-literacy, early numeracy, there's gross motor skills. And these sort of standardized approaches allow us to make claims about level of services, because sometimes parents have expectations. Well, I want them to be able to do X, Y, and Z. And then we can say, well, a typically developing 4-year-old or a typically developing 5-year-old would be able to do this. And we're not going to set a higher expectation for a student who's struggling because it's just not really realistic. And what we want to do then is focus on the skills that the student is struggling with, so they have equitable opportunities when they move into the next general education classroom or next age or grade level. So we get a lot of questions around fluency. A lot of the goals are set in terms of proficiency. They're sometimes said, oh, well, that's just a fluency goal and I'm looking for something else. But fluency is a predictor of proficiency, because kids who are able, especially in later grades, to quickly access content, whether it's oral or written or visual, are able to make more progress because they have more opportunities for feedback and practice. So this idea of proficiency in the early childhood grades is really critical. And some people say, well, that's not fair that we're timing kids, it causes stress. Well, the research is really clear that it doesn't. It's often more stressful for teachers because they're worried that the kids' performance is going to be a reflection of them, as opposed to saying the performance is a reflection of the program that may be teaching the skill mastery, but maybe not helping them translate it. So then it gives us information about how do we adapt that program or change it so that the kid can be more proficient. So it's meant to help us, not be a reflection of us. So just some other things as we start to get into these goal setting practices is being very honest about what is an appropriate skill to be measured at the grade or age that you're working with, right? And sometimes we have assumptions that everybody else is doing that. In reality, no one else is doing that. Or our expectation for this child's behavior is beyond what a typically developing expectation would be, or sometimes it's less, right? Like, I think it's okay that the kid can walk around and pull things off the shelf because I tolerate it. And really what we're looking for is what's necessary for this kid to be successful where they're going. Other things you take into account, obviously, are costs and administration or costs and training, but I would say more importantly is the administration and scoring time. We don't want to spend more than 8% of our time in any point of time doing assessment, right? Progress monitoring, that's part of instruction, but or monitoring progress, it's part of instruction, but I'm talking about diagnostic, formal progress monitoring that we just talked about, evaluation data. We don't want to be spending a ton of time doing that. So we're looking for something that's efficient, but generally effective. All right, so before we get started, and I want to take just a 5-minute break before we get into the actual activities. One, I want you to download, make sure you download the handouts, because you are going to do some activities. You don't have to print them if you don't want to. You can actually use paper pencil, but you won't be able to see the handouts on my screen because it's just smaller, and you want to be able to have those handouts in front of you. So we'll put the link back in the chat box, and that's that bottom link under materials. So we're going to take about a 5-minute break. You can get up, go to the bathroom, but also give you some time to submit any questions that you're pondering or you want answered, and then get those materials. All right. Any questions or comments from the panelists before we take a quick break? All right.
Yes, there is a question in the Q&A. Somebody would like to ask you a question on the break if you're available.
I am.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll take 5 minutes, which means we'll come back exactly at 10:59 and a half. So we'll get started in about 30 seconds. All right, so we'll get started. And we have a great question that actually sort of gets us started with this. And it has to do, and I'm going to partially read it and then summarize part of it, is we have goals of where we want students to end at the end of kindergarten and the end of first grade. And so when writing an IEP at the beginning of a school year, should we write a goal on those even if we haven't taught the skill yet? So an example is, can you write a goal about CBC even if we haven't started teaching CBC yet? I'm going to say yes, as long as your data from your present levels of academic and functional performance indicate that that is an essential skill, right? If we haven't taught it yet, we don't really know if it's a need, because if we are providing high quality instruction, it could be that this student will pick that up in their general education class or not. So your data needs to justify that that is a valid goal. Now, in terms of not being taught yet, that's okay, because really what you're looking for, particularly in the early childhood, are general outcome measures. And in pre-K, kindergarten, and part of first grade, meaning the first semester of first grade, we tend to use criterion-based approaches as opposed to like a more general measure like reading connected text. And that's because we don't expect kids to be reading connected text until the middle of first grade. So there's all these prerequisite skills, like you were just saying, decoding, right? CBC, or nonsense word fluency, or phonological awareness, or phoneme segmentation. Those are skills that we see as essential prerequisites for the student to be able to read connected text by the middle of kindergarten. So if your data suggests, yeah, they're going to need that skill, then I would do it. And I will say, if you're writing it for the end of that, there are measures like nonsense word fluency, which is a much more general outcome rather than CBC. CBC is a very limited skill set. While it is helpful, it's a subskill, right? It goes along with sight words and blends and vowel consonant E. And if you just do CBC, then what you're saying is the other skills are not part of that set. So instead, maybe look at something that's more of a general measure for the goal in which CVC would be taught, as well as all sorts of other phonics skills that would make up for that. So I hope that makes sense, and we can, good. And then, so there's a link, Kimberly, the link for the PowerPoint is in the chat box. Again, we'll post that for you. Yeah. Yeah, so, and I think that being flexible, particularly if you're not sure if the kid has that skill, but you know it's going to be essential skill, is using a general outcome measure gives you that flexibility, right? So that, let's say the kid picks up, like they, I don't know, they start taking meds, or it just clicks with them. You'll see sometimes, and they start to master that skill. There are other skills that you can then sort of intensify with your instruction or adapt your instruction to still get that kid to whatever outcome that you're trying to achieve. Now, I want to move us into goal setting because we've talked a little bit about this benchmark as being very clear about why we're working towards a certain goal versus another. So this is actually an example that we saw in an IEP. And it was for a first grader, actually. And when I saw the goal, it was standardized, right? Like it used all the structure of the goal, and they were able to demonstrate baseline and up into the goal. And when I asked the teacher, well, why did you set the goal that way? She said something that sort of caught me off guard and made me a little pit in my stomach. And she said, based on what he's learning, that's where I think he's going to be able to get. That's not the way that we should set goals, because this particular measure that they were doing, in order to demonstrate readiness for the next skill, a kid would need to have 60 responses correct, right? And by setting a 40 responses so that the kid could meet some goal, the teacher actually lowered the expectation for the student. And this is exactly what the Supreme Court in Andrew, which was in your 10th Circuit, was looking at, is that are we unintentionally setting low expectations that are setting kids up for failure? In early childhood, we have the greatest window of opportunity. So we want to be as close to grade level benchmarks or performance levels as we can, because it's easier for us to intensify supports in early childhood than it is when a kid gets to late elementary or even secondary settings. And we also hear from secondary teachers that those essential skills necessary for success in secondary are taught in these early grades. And part of that is proficiency in particular subskills necessary for learning. So when we set goals, we want to be able to clearly say how we set the goal, and we want to be able to justify why we set it that way, right? We can't just say, well, I think. If that's our go-to, then we are sort of setting ourselves up for potential concern or even student failure. And instead, we want to say things like, based on the student's baseline data and their age or grade level and their level of needs, this is a valid goal that's based on one of these three procedures, right? That puts it not on what I think about the kid, but what is ambitious, but also realistic for the kid. And setting that goal in that way, then we're not thinking about program that sets the goal, right? Like, oh, I'm only meeting the kid for 45 minutes 2 times a week. Let's not set the goal too high, to instead saying this kid's baseline is here and where they need to be is here. We need to provide a much more level of intense services in this year in order to get that kid caught up, because if we wait too long, that gap is going to increase over time. And by 3rd grade, it's really hard for us to remediate gaps that started in pre-K, K, and 1. So in your handouts, the very first page, there are 3 options that we offer. And these are ways you can set 3 goals, to be honest, and then bring those to an IEP meeting and say, look, if we set it based on benchmark or where typically developing kids would be, this would be the goal. If we set it based on a rate of improvement, which is not always applicable in early childhood because it's more criterion based, we could do that. But then there's also this intra-individual approach, and I'm going to share all 3 of those. So baseline is really the simplest and the preferred approach, particularly in early childhood, because what it's doing is setting a goal that's getting a kid to a level of proficiency that is considered predictive of success in core programming, right? It's saying that if a kid is here with this skill set, they'll be able to access and benefit from the core curriculum, whether they have a disability or not. That's not really what it takes into account. But what it looks at is what are benchmarks that we would expect kids to be at in fall, winter, spring, or maybe it's quarterly, but they're standardized and validated across a large subset of students that are similar age or grade. And the way that we are able to use benchmarks or any of these goal setting procedures is we get what we refer to as a baseline that's either through mean or median. And I'm going to just quickly do this because a lot of people say, oh, I can't remember. But mean is where you take 3 numbers, add them, divide by 3 in this case, or median is where you rank your numbers and pick the middle score, right? So there are 2 different reasons we would do one or the other. Behavior tends to use mean more frequently. Pre-academics or academics tends to use median. So just keep that in mind. So here's an example. I have 3 of these approaches, and I could do a mean, which means I add them all together, divide by 3 because there are 3 responses. But in this case, we took all of these scores at the same time, so we're going to take a median approach. So what I would do is I would rank them from the lowest to highest. So I have 8, 11, and 13, and then I select the middle score. So you're probably seeing the middle score in this case would be 11, right? That allows me to sort of take out the outliers. This is the data that would go in my class statement in my IEP because it's justifying the goal that I'm about to set and where the student is starting from. The baseline does not have to be in the goal. Some people write it that way, but there is no legal requirement, unless WGE has something different, that says the baseline needs to be there. Really what we're setting is the annual goal with the understanding that the baseline is in the class statement. So there are some cases where you may take 3 data points over 3 periods of time, like you took it over the last 3 weeks. That's where you would typically use a mean. So we see this more with behavior. You did the number of times the kid got out of his seat and you did it over 3 days, we would use a mean score as the baseline. All right, so you're going to do this really quickly. You're going to use the chat box so I can see that some of you are still there. This is a pretty easy one, but you got these 3 probes from the student. They did them all at the same time. So which probe would you use as your baseline for goal setting and would include in your class? Don't worry about what the skill is. Yeah, thanks, Robin. You were the winner for being first and accurate. A couple, yeah. So everybody's saying 1. So remember, if we rank them 1, 2, 3, the middle number would be that 2. So our baseline would be 2. And that's because kids perform differently at different times. So we're just sort of taking the median score. So in your handout packet, you have this little handout, and this is a very basic way to graph and monitor progress monitoring goals. Progress monitoring, if you remember, has to be graphed. Otherwise, it's just a collection of numbers. And it has to be graphed because we need to compare it against a goal, right? It's not a quantitative comparison, it's a visual comparison to that goal. So if you have your handout and printed and you can do that, this is where we would put the baseline. This is what we would bring to an IEP meeting to say, look, Jane, we did a baseline data on this. This is where her baseline is. And then we can have an authentic discussion with the family and the other members of the team about where we're going to set the goal, because it's the team, right, that sets the goal, not an individual person. Now, that benchmark goal setting that I kind of mentioned is really the go-to, and that's the one I'm going to talk about first, but I'm also going to talk about national norms, which is applicable in some measures more for first grade, but not so much for the 3 to 5-year-olds and kindergarten students. And then I'm also going to talk about intra-individual. So benchmarking is pretty simple. You just find a tool that has benchmarks already available, and you would put that on your graph. So for example, in the back of your handout packet, you will see national benchmarks for early literacy. And when I say early literacy, these would be 3 to 5. Well, also, there is a link for the DIBELS that go all the way from kindergarten to 8th grade, but we can see this for math. Most tools have something like this if they're published. And what you see is this one, that really refers to tier 1 in an MTSS. This is where we would expect kids who are on target to be, right? And if our kids showed up below or in the cut score or below here, that would tell us that this kid may need specially designed instruction or additional support in that area. So that would be a measure I would set a goal for. And the goal would likely be the benchmark, right? I want them to have the same opportunities as other kids. So I want to get them to the same level of proficiency. And you can see that they're for fall, winter, spring, because as much as we would love to write our IEPs all at the beginning of the year for the school year, which would be ideal, sometimes we get an IEP that's written in the middle of the year or at the end of the year. And that kind of comes back to what you were saying, Lindsay, is maybe they're a kindergartner, but I want to set the goal with the anticipation of mid-year first grade. So I would look at mid-year first grade benchmarks. So in this case, I would set the goal at 15, right? Because that's what was on that graph, and I would draw it. And this would be the conversation we would have with the family of this is the goal we're going to set, and then I'm going to keep you updated about progress towards that goal, right? Because I'm just going to graph it on the paper or in the system if I like fancy stuff. And as I mentioned, you can do mid-year goals as well. And this is if maybe the kid is not yet qualified, but they're in a fall needing intervention, I can also set that goal for the mid-year and then extend it if needed. This is something you can do on an IEP as well, as maybe they're in kindergarten and moving into first grade. You can set a kindergarten benchmark goal so that they're getting to the end of kindergarten mid-year, right? And then the next goal would be by the end of the middle of first grade, they would be a different benchmark. So it's a little more, instead of like one goal would be before the other. Now, if you are familiar with DIBELS, which it sounds like some of you are, what you'll see is there are these benchmarks that exist that we also need to think about. And so if we are working in 3 to 4 programs, right, moving into kindergarten, you'll see here that kids only need to be coming in with 11 letter names, right? This is a proficient letter name. And if we're having an IEP goal that's like the kid's going to learn 20 letters, we may be setting a goal that's much more rigorous or ambitious than expectation. So understanding the benchmarks for the next grade level or age level can help us be more thoughtful about our benchmarks. So you can see that there are different measures. Letter naming is actually a measure of rapid naming that just uses letters. It's not does the kid know all their letters, but there's also phonological awareness measures, nonsense word fluency, which goes back to what Lindsay mentioned about CVC, and that gets more as an indicator of decoding, right? It's not a direct measure like mastery measure, it's an indicator of that particular skill. Word use fluency, that's your sight words. So that's where you would see that kids don't need to come in from pre-K knowing sight words, but they would need to be more proficient at kindergarten. So we're providing the exposure in pre-K, so they're more ready for kindergarten. So some pros and cons, it's super easy to use, but there are some places where it might be unrealistic. But just remember that the sooner we're all collectively using benchmarks, we have a consistent expectation of where kids need to be so that the pre-K expectations align with what's happening at K1. So what I'd like to do is just a real quick activity. So this is in your handouts, and I'm going to not give you a ton of time because it's not a really complex activity. But in your handout, what you'll see is this worksheet for calculating goals. In the back of your handout, you will see the published norms, right, or benchmarks for these particular measures. And these are pre-K measures, but the same thing would apply if you were using kindergarten DIBELS or FastBridge, or even some first grade measures, is that there is a benchmark score that exists. You'll see this is the kid's baseline data. So you'll be able to see where does this kid fall in relationship to the benchmark, okay? Now, because we're primarily special ed teachers, I want you to set this as the end of the year goal for this particular student, or end of the year IEP for this student. Okay. So any questions? All right, so then when we come back, I'm going to give you about 4 minutes to do this. And ideally, I would send you off into groups and you could chat with each other. But we don't have that capability. So what I'd like you to do is, maybe if you have your cat or your dog, if you're at home, or some other peers at your school, is to chat about where you would set that goal for that particular student for picture naming, who got an initial benchmark score of 4, and what would be their goal. Okay. Any questions? And Susan or Dina, I don't know if you can see something that I can't see. I don't see anything in the chat box.
No, I think we're good in the chat box and in the Q&A. So
Okay, perfect.
The activity. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to give you about 4 minutes to do that, because I think you'll find the first 2 might take you a little while to get used to it, and then it'll make a little bit more sense. And I'll be in the chat if you have any specific questions. Otherwise, 4 minutes. And if you have that, I will scoot back to the benchmarks in case you want to see those as well. So you have about 1 minute. And I will just say, those of you who are in kindergarten, first grade, The same data exists for nonsense word fluency, letter naming fluency, word use fluency, is that there's a cut score and then there's a proficiency criteria. So this is just an example for activity purposes. All right, you have about 5 seconds. We'll wrap it up. Okay. So if we look at this particular student's baseline data, we see picture naming as 4. And we're just going to do 2 of them for illustrative purposes. But we'll see she got rhyming, she got a 1, and then picture naming, she got a 4. So let's look real quickly at what she did. So right now we'll see that the 4 and the 1 for these two, she definitely fell below the cut score. So in the chat box, if you can just tell me what goal you would set for the student as a realistic, ambitious outcome. You just put the number in the chat. And I won't say your name, so you can anonymously put that there. Yes, so we have 6 to 10, 11. Some other folks, yeah, some 11s. 10. So you can see, and this actually is what happens in an IEP meeting. There's no one reason, right? We don't really know the background of this student. We can just look at the baseline and the benchmarks that exist. And it's really the team's understanding of that child and their skill set and where they need to be. Now, a lot of you selected the bottom of the tier 1. Which is kind of like the cut score. You can see this is the minimum that we would expect, like 6 to 10. But a lot of you are like, you know, I want this student to be proficient. And so I'm going to set it at an 11. And this is where we have to really be honest. And having this sort of standardized approach to validated goal setting can help us better engage families in the goal setting process, right? And we can justify, well, I'm going to set the goal. I think we should set it around 11 because of this. And somebody can say, wow, 10 is better. And somebody may say, well, no, I think we should be way more ambitious. Maybe she can't get to 15 because we want to give her some room for error. But if we can get it at 13, then I would feel very confident that she was ready for the tier 1 success in tier 1 instruction. So that's that conversation. And that conversation gets written into our class, right? It justifies why we're setting the goal the way we're setting it. Now, something I would caution is setting a goal lower in the early grades can set you up in the long term for concern. So I would be ambitious as much as possible in these early grades. And that's because this is our window of opportunity. The other thing I just want to point out too is picture naming is the skill. And it doesn't mean that, oh my gosh, she's in the lower, I need to do direct instruction in picture naming. That's not what we're looking for. The underlying skill for this goal is can they recognize and label, right? That's really the underlying skill. So it's not just a specific set of words or pictures we're trying to teach. It's that we're going to make sure embedded into their general instruction, their home instruction or home environment, and then the special education environment is that we're really working on vocabulary, right? That's really what we're looking at. And then this measure will help us get an indicator of, is her vocabulary increasing, right? So one last one, what did you put for rhyming? She had a 1 on rhyming. Yeah, 7 to 11. So looking at that cut score. And this is where we may say, gosh, her baseline is way at the bottom, right? So her room for growth is a little bit higher. Yeah, I like that. Robin put it at the 9, like right in the center. So this is where we could say, well, gosh, she needs this skill to be ready for kindergarten, right? I don't want to cut her short. So like Lindsay put a 12. So what we're saying is, you know, I want to be pretty ambitious. And then because of the discrepancy between baseline and the goal, it helps me then make a decision about the intensity of the specially designed instruction that I'm going to give the student, right? And if I only have 2 times 45 minutes a week, then I want to make sure that I'm collaborating with the parent or the general education teacher to make sure there are increased opportunities around rhyming or vocabulary in those settings so that we can really get this kid to reach those ambitious goals. Great, thanks y'all. So I just want to briefly share another approach, which is a weekly rate of improvement. And I say this because it's a helps you set up for an individualized growth goal, but most tools that are available, or progress monitoring, benchmark, and tools that are available for early childhood don't use growth rates. And that's because they're more criterion based, as I said, right? That unlike reading connected text that you tend to see mid first grade and up, you can have a range of what would be proficiency. But in early grades, we tend to say, this is kind of the cut score, right? That kids who don't have vocabulary proficiency or phonological awareness proficiency tend to really struggle. So you just got to get them to this benchmark. But with, you may have some measures that maybe are coming out soon. This is in the first page of your handout, so I did want to share it with you. But this could be taking a nationally published rate of improvement, where you can say most kindergartners, let's say, learn 1 new sight word a week. That would be a rate of improvement. Or with speech, kids learn X number of utterances or new vocabulary words, right? So sometimes there are growth rates that are out there, but they don't tend to show up in standardized tools the way that we see them in upper grades. And that's because the range is so great of kids. But what we would do is take that rate of improvement, we would multiply it times the number of weeks. So if it's an IEP, the 36 instructional weeks, or in this case, it's just an intervention goal, and then we would do it times 10 weeks. So that would give us what we would expect to change in that period of time, and then we just add it to the baseline, right? And then that would give us a goal. So if we're in an IEP meeting, for example, I could share the benchmark, and maybe the benchmark is like way out there, right? The kid has 0 and the benchmark is 60. We could, in a sense, use a rate of improvement where the kid is progressing at the same rate as their same age peers, but may not be able in this year to reach the same benchmark as them. So that's kind of where we might use this. Most systems right now already have it. So those of you in FastBridge, or if you're in Dibbles, you already have those measures. But sometimes if we're doing like a behavioral goal or an early numeracy, early literacy goal, we just won't see them. There's no average rate of improvement of a 4-year-old learning certain skills. And that's because they're not as, like we were saying with reading, not as concrete or teachable. They're more related to exposure. And our goal is really to provide adequate opportunities to exposure and practice with those skills. So just some cons as well, they may not be available, but I will say for those of you in K-1-2, if you use growth rates, it actually can help you with your SLD eligibility discussions, because one of the things that we encourage is looking at not just the discrepancy, but is this kid able to progress at the same rate as their peers? And if so, especially designed instruction necessary for that to happen. So you can have some pretty robust conversations about that. So another option, though, that may really be useful for you all is not to necessarily take an average national growth rate, because they don't exist for some tools, but instead use the student's previous growth rate. And this is where we're setting a modified goal, meaning we have made a decision as a team that this student cannot progress at the same rate as their peers and is not likely to meet grade level benchmarks or A level benchmarks because of their disability, right? So kids with really significant disabilities. And so what you do instead is you look at a previous rate of improvement and use that previous rate of improvement to create a truly individualized goal for the student. While this is a great approach, it has some pretty significant limitations and should really be used as a last resort because it ultimately lowers the expectations. And in a sense, we're making a decision that this student is not able to achieve similar to their same age peers. And doing that very early on in their educational career can really set them up. So we tend to recommend sticking with benchmarks, rates of improvement if they exist from the national level in early grades, and then use non-response or progress monitoring data to make claims as an IEP team that maybe that growth is not realistic and an individualized goal is needed. So I'll show you what it looks like. The formula is in the first page of your handout, but what you do need is progress monitoring data. So this is why I say if you set a goal using benchmark and you've gotten 8 weeks of progress and you're providing very intensive support, and this kid is not progressing towards that goal, then this is where the conversations are, maybe it's a learning issue that's so severe that the kid is going to perform at a different level. Not that they just need intensive instruction, but they also need a different expectation. So we take and find what is their individual rate of improvement, and then use a goal setting. We just take the median, right, of the last 3. So that's where the median comes into play. And then we set a goal for that kid, right? And so we use the same formula that we did before. Now, what you'll notice is that we don't want to maintain the same growth rate, right? We go back to Andrew, we're looking for ambitious growth. So what we're looking for is previous growth plus some. So that's why you'll see in the calculation this 1.5, right? And so it's saying your original growth was 1 word read correct, or one pointing or 1 labeling or whatever the measure might be, and saying, I want that 1 plus another half, right? I want to make it more. The thing that we really want to focus on is that we're setting appropriate goals from the beginning. And if we set them using these rationales, then what we can say is we're not going to lower the goal, that instead this kid might really need just much more intensive supports at this moment. And that can help us as an IEP team be really realistic about the number of minutes, the types of supports. And I know sometimes this seems like an arbitrary decision, particularly for newly identified students. So some cons, it is the least ambitious. So just take it with caution. Don't make it your go-to. Just make it, that even if you use this type of goal at an IEP meeting, I would present the grade level or age level expected benchmark and talk about, if we set the goal this way, these are some of the potential consequences of that for the student. So we're not going to do this activity because I want to push you to really think about benchmarks first. But in the handout, there's an opportunity to do this as a practice, right? And to build your proficiency in goal setting. Goal setting doesn't come naturally. It requires us to be very standardized in the way that we think about goals and be aware of the resources that are available. And I want to share a couple of resources as we close up that can help you do this type of work. But I put the answers in there as well. But the answers are also in a resource called Setting Ambitious Academic IEP Goals, as well as Setting Data-Based Behavioral Goals. And I think, Supriya, those are at the end. You can find the links for those, but Supriya will put those in the chat box. So all the answers are there. There are academic literacy, there's math, and then there's also behavior practice opportunities. So when we think about goal setting, we I tended to focus on the goal itself, but I just want to clarify that the target behavior, that's really what we just talked about, that the goal also has to clarify the condition and the level of proficiency. So just remember in that handout or that resource guide I just talked about that we'll put the link in the chat box, it gives you that formula so that you're talking about the time frame when given 1 minute, when given a probe, when given 2 distractors, when asked a question, right? That there's some context that the layperson could understand, then the goal that we just talked about makes sense, right? It has context. The other thing is thinking about that level of proficiency. Typically with a criterion measure, we may be looking for that level of proficiency on 3 consecutive probes. But in many cases, meeting that at a single probe would be sufficient. So we see that with benchmarks in K1. So I just want to share another tool that I have placed in your handout packet, and that's around some behavioral monitoring, progress monitoring. And these to me have really a lot of application for preschool in the K1-2 setting, and to get us to think more strategically about how we monitor and write goals for behavior. So the same thing applies, right? That we can write a mastery type measure, as I mentioned. Let me get this graphic here, right? We can have a goal, an IEP goal that's a direct measure, like the student will raise their hand, the student will stay in their seat. You know, that's very specific. But from an IEP standpoint, that assumes the kid is only going to have one behavior concern. And most kids, when you address one concern, a new one occurs. And you want to avoid having to reconvene an IEP meeting or write something else. So using something that's a little more generalized for your behavior goal setting and progress monitoring can make your life a lot easier. So I just want to briefly share the direct behavior rating. It is its own training in and of itself. But if you look at it, we have found preschools in Wyoming with very limited support, and we'll put the link to where you can learn more, can easily do this, right? It's already created for you. It's kind of like if you're familiar with check-in and check-out, it's a more individualized version of check-in and check-out for 3 specific behaviors. It's nice because it's valid and reliable, but it's also really feasible. It doesn't take the teacher very long, maybe a couple of seconds in which to do the rating, and then you just have to go back and graph it. It is not a direct measure of the behavior, and some people get concerned about that, but it's not feasible for a teacher to really measure direct behavior. Right? If I have 4 kids in my classroom who have behavior goals, and I have to check every time that so-and-so does this skill and this other kid does this skill, I just can't do that. And so using something like the behavior rating allows me at the end of my intervention period or time frame to just real quickly rate each kid. And there's a lot of validity and reliability in that measure. There are 3 standardized measures that are already created, but what you can also do, and I put a blank copy, is you can make up your own. The process is still the same, but if you're looking in early childhood, what we're looking for is academic engagement, right? And that's a very broad term, but we can use that as an IEP general outcome measure, right? I want to ensure that the student is academically engaged at 80% on 3 consecutive days or something. Like, you can set your goal. And because of this concept of academic engagement, respectful behavior, non-disruptive, we can have a sort of broader sense of those behaviors. So I'll give you, in your handouts, you can see an example, but this is what academic engagement might look like. You can define it, right? You can say, hey, IEP team, when we think about academic engagement for this 4-year-old, this is how we define it so that it's clear for everyone. but you'll see that it's active or passive participation in a classroom activity. It could be a recess activity or a community activity. It doesn't really matter. But what you're doing is defining what that is. You could use the same tool for all of your kids, right? And this could be something that, you know, most of your kids are working on increasing academic engagement in your special ed preschool so that they can be successful in kindergarten. But you can see like appropriate play, looking at the instructional materials, things it's not. So you could include non-examples, wandering around the classroom, you know, talking on different topics or whatever it might be, you can define those. And then what happens is the tool itself is just a rating. So at the end of every instructional period, you just say, you know what, I estimate based on what I saw, 60% of the time he was engaged. And it seems kind of biased, but what we found is teachers' beliefs about their student behavior are predictive about referrals or concerns or how teachers respond. So the teacher's belief about the student's engagement is a critical measure of success. So the way this would be interpreted is the teacher estimates the kid was academically engaged based on our definition 60% of the time, right? So instead of having to, every time the kid looked at me, put a mark, now I can just sit at the end and say, gosh, yeah, he was pretty engaged. I was really pleased with today. And then the teacher can focus on the overall collection of behaviors instead of a single behavior. The same thing is for things like non-disruptive behavior. That's what we're looking at is if you have a kid who's struggling with out of seat or fidgeting or playing with objects or touching or, you know, wandering around, things that are disrupting the classroom, that if they're moving from a preschool program to kindergarten or kindergarten to first grade would interfere with their or other kids' learning, then this is maybe a tool or a progress monitoring goal you would use or an IEP goal. And so what you can see is that, I would recommend writing this as non-disruptive behavior, the percentage of the time the kid engaged in appropriate behavior in a sense. And so what you're looking for is a level of proficiency. The same thing occurs with respect. You can see that there's examples and non-examples so that if that is something the kid is struggling with, you know, how to function respectfully in a classroom, you can have that. Now, what's nice about these, as I mentioned, is they're completely customizable. So I provided you with a standardized one, but there's also this free blank one that if you have a, like, let's say social skills or social and emotional, you know, language or gross motor, instead of doing a direct measure that takes more time and more effort, you can write the behavior description in a much more general way, right? And then set the goal based on that. So the tools, we put the chat box in there, and then we wanna make sure that you know, you can access those, but these are free for everyone. So yeah, you can create tools. The tools are already available, but I just wanted to share that because there are a lot or several preschools that are using this type of approach. The progress monitoring graphs look a little bit different, right? So you can see pencil throwing is a mastery measure, right? It's a single skill measure. That means I have to count every time the kid threw the pencil. If I use DBR, what I can get is a percentage of time in which the kid was engaged in non-disruptive behavior, which would include not throwing the pencil, but also all of the other disruptive behaviors that may exist, right? Your instruction may focus on not throwing the pencil, but your goal and the measure in which you're monitoring the goal focuses on something bigger. All right, so just in summary, you know, that we're writing goals. I would recommend a few really critical general goals as opposed to a bunch of individual mastery goals. It's easier to manage, and it also allows you to think more comprehensively about how you design your special education program and how you collaborate with general education or the family for the home setting. And so when you write your goal, just make sure that you have the critical features of it, not just the goal itself, which we talked about today, but like with the DBR, this is where you would say, you know, in this proficiency and timeline as measured by DBR or direct behavior rating. so that when you're saying something like academically engaged or appropriately engaged 80% of the time, people understand that there's a direct behavior rating that you've already created to measure what that is. Something else I'll just really push you guys to think about is making the IEP goals feasible. That's why we're writing them in a way that we can easily monitor them, that the expectations are very clear, and focusing on ones that we can easily grasp, so that anytime somebody can come in and say, how is so-and-so doing on their progress, I can pull that graph data and say, here's the goal, here's the baseline, this is where this kid is right now. If we don't have that easy accessibility, it could be that we're writing goals that are too vague or too complex for us to measure. Now, we don't have time for this, but as I mentioned in the goal setting guides that we've shared, is that there are templates, right, for the actual structure of the goal, but you should never use a template in writing a goal. Like, all kids with autism have this goal, and you probably already know that, but I'll just say that. But what you could see is that kids are using the same tool, but they could actually have the same quantifiable goal, but you have to just demonstrate in your class that in choosing that goal, you took an individualized approach, right? So we can have the same things, but the process to get to that goal was individualized. All right, and if you don't have tools, you're like, I don't have any pre-literacy tools or early numeracy tools, or I don't have a graphing tool. The WinWeb has, which is the Wyoming Instructional Network, has a lot of great tools that it will link you to. You can also email me or connect with the Progress Center or the National Center on Intensive Intervention. And there's also a resource for early childhood grade or ages 3 to 5 in terms of these types of goal setting tools, and they're called the IGDs, and they're indicators of IGDs, growth and development, something like that. But they have about 20 years of research data. They were supported by the US Department of Ed in their development. Okay. So we'll just close up. I'm going to give my last 9 minutes. I'm going to take one more to Susan, but I just want to reiterate how important goal setting is to everything that we do in supporting students, right? If we're not clear about where we're going, then we often don't choose the right supports for those students, and we risk setting that kid up for long-term failure because we haven't been very strategic about the sequencing of goals that a kid might experience from age 3 to 4 to kindergarten to first grade and so on, right? They're not disconnected, even though a different teacher or a different school might write those goals. And we have to use the data, once we set a goal, that's not it. We have to continue to monitor the student's progress towards that goal. That's required as part of your IEP. It's required as, under IDEA. And if students are not showing progress, which you have to report, then we have to do our due diligence to respond and look for ways to intensify or adapt. So I'll just close up here, and in the chat, I'd love you just to share out, something that you'll do differently as a result of today. My recommendations are look at your own goals, and I'm sure you're doing great stuff. And so highlight some of the good things and maybe some things for improvement, and then really just thinking about practice. Okay. So Susan, I'll pass it over to you to close us up.
Thank you so much, Tessie. It's been really good information. One thing we know is goal writing can be very complex. And so thank you for the information. I hope you all found it helpful.